Thank you, Matt and Brittany. That was wonderful. Besides the interruption, I loved it. Please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Jessica Pearson. She is a professor at SUNY Potsdam and chair of the Department of Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Pearson will share her insights on the invasive yet beautiful purple loosestrife, and as well as ways to mitigate it and techniques to intervene. So please welcome Jessica Pearson.
Hi, everybody. It's not up yet. So I want to thank Dan and Emma for setting everything up for me, and thank you, Bridget, for that introduction. As she said, I'm Dr. Jess Pearson. I grew up in Potsdam, and so when I finished most of my undergrad, I went away for about 10 years, came back, lived in Kenya, worked on conservation there. The biggest thing that touched me when I came back is some of the wetlands started to look different, and that's where a lot of this work and this project came from. Is something you just notice from your childhood. It looks different and you wonder why if you're a good biologist. And so I'm going to start my talk with an apology, as I start all of my talks about this topic. And from there, I'll give you a little biology of the background of the purple loosestrife, where it came from, a little bit of the path through my research, how it got to where it is today, a little bit about mapping, where it is, why we map it, and then a biological control and building a beetle hatchery. And then ultimately I'll end with what we can do and hopefully move forward with the message. So the apology. I'm going to talk a lot about a species that is really beautiful, and you're going to look at it from now on going forward and know how horrible it is for our environment. So I apologize for ruining that for you, but I'm sorry it's going to happen. So purple loosestrife, or Lythrum salicaria, which you'll see in a lot of notes on the slides, is a grass that grows almost everywhere in upstate New York. It'll grow on roadsides. It can grow up to 2 meters tall. It grows in very large monocultures, and it was introduced in the mid-1800s. There's some evidence it came in sheep's wool, and the seeds were just caught. And then it was deliberately distributed across North America in many ways through wildflower packets as recently as 2019 in Cheerios New Bees. So please check before you distribute any wildflower seeds now, because it inadvertently could become part of the landscape where you don't want it. There's documented sightings in New York State as early as the 1960s. So why does it become invasive, right? There's a lot of literature on how a species becomes invasive. Not every introduced species becomes a problem. Not every introduced species becomes what's called invasive. Purple loosestrife specifically is very good at being exactly what an invasive species is meant to do. It creates monocultures, it drives out everything else besides itself as much as possible. It provides minimal nutrition, minimal habitat for all of the ecosystem that's already here, and it adapts to a lot of different environments. As a comparison, you can see on the slide, the top two are native species that end up in these same areas that occupy a very similar niche. The cattails through the wetlands, and then goldenrod across the areas. So they're designed very much to move through the system, to be constantly replenished. So cattails have that very narrow root structure. They do tend to be tied together, so they create those mats that float down the river. And then goldenrod, you can even get a 3 meter tall goldenrod. If you get a good grip, you can pull it out by the roots. One person, no problem. It's not meant to be this permanent structure. In contrast, on the bottom, this is a purple loosestrife that we dug out. This is one plant, but its root structure is so tightly connected to all of the other plants, you literally need a saw to get through its woody root structure. So that flat image you see at the bottom, that's the saw cutting with a root to get a grass out of the ground in a wetland. It should be so boggy, it should come right out, but it doesn't. So that's one of the reasons it causes this big problem. So, as I said, I came back to the North Country and started teaching at SUNY Potsdam in 2016. finishing my PhD on remote sensing of Central African protected areas, and started looking at how I can apply that to the North Country. The wetlands specifically outside of Canton at Upper and Lower Lakes Wildlife Management Area had all these plants I'd never seen before. And so I started looking, I looked at the DEC website, and this is how many places they had seen it in 2015. To zoom in, there were 4 recognized areas in St. Lawrence County in 2015. Anyone who's driven through the North Country in August knows they were underrepresented. So I got some terrific grant funding from the St. Lawrence River Research and Education Fund, SLRF, and I started looking at this. So in 2017, I had 2 terrific interns who basically helped me come up with the methodology, and with some advice from the SLRF people, we collected a lot of data. We used remote techniques. We carried all of the data on our phones. We collected how big the infestation was, how far apart they were. The biology of purple loosestrife means it can spread about 10 meters a year. From a given plant, it'll drop about 300,000 seeds, but not really further than about 10 meters. It's not wind transported, it doesn't rely on animals, it just sort of falls. A little bit of wind will push it a few feet, but 10 meters is about as far as it'll go. And then you get another one, and then you get another one. So trying to figure out how big the infestations were, where they were, and what kind of environment was going on. We didn't know what we were looking for. My big hypothesis at the time was somehow mowing was looking at this, so we stayed right on the roadsides, right? We didn't have to negotiate with individual private landowners. We just walked the roadsides. So in 2017, we walked 88 miles of road on both sides, so really 176. But I didn't tell them when they applied that that's what they would be doing. And they were beautifully happy. This is our communications photo. And we worked out in the field all day, every day, from the middle of July to the middle of August. And this is what they usually looked like when they sent me a photo saying, this is how the day is going. It is warm on the roadsides with no shade and only the wind from the traffic honking by you. But we got a lot of information. So the route we took, specifically, I was really curious, was this spreading south from Canada? Was it spreading up from 81, or was it coming up from the Adirondacks? Where was this concentration? Could we see a landscape level change? So we mapped from the blue lines on Route 56, 268 all the way to Ogdensburg, and then that first year we went all the way down to Alex Bay and all the way north to Waddington. That was the 88 miles we started with. And we found a lot of information. There were not 4 locations, there were over 600 individual infestations of purple loosestrife. It was somewhere around 45,000 individual plants just within 5 meters of the roadside. Yes. So we started to look at it. This is our first testing year, right? The first year is an anomaly. The second year is a coincidence. The third year is data. So we kept going, and I won't go into the details of every individual year. The second year, we proved our method worked. The number of sites was about the same. You'd be able to see the difference. We had a few more plants, which again, you'd expect. It was a really similar weather year. All the other things hadn't changed. And then we did it one more year in 2019 to demonstrate we had real methods that could capture what we were looking for. The numbers went up a lot. We're starting to figure out how to do this, where it was. There was a relative drought in 2018, and 2019 we saw a pretty big explosion. Again, it's not definitive yet, but we're getting there. And most importantly, the method can be repeated over and over, and it wasn't that difficult to do. But I'll get into this. So we changed a little bit in how we collected. For GIS nerds, we went from point data to line data to make it a little easier to map the landscape and to start looking at changes. One of the other things we did, at every site we found purple loosestrife, we identified every plant larger than 6 inches within 1 meter of the plants to try to figure out what was influencing purple loosestrife. What are we seeing growing at the same time? And over the first 3 years, we identified over 100 different individual species of plants, the most common in different areas of the microcosms all across the North Country are cattails and wild parsnip, one of the ones you see along the roads, goldenrod, things you'd expect, Queen Anne's lace, some native, about half invasive as well, or non-native. So So we really started to look at that. We were able to use apps. The development of Picture This and Snap and all of those things made a lot of that easier. But we also have a perfectly customized guidebook for just the plants you'd expect to see on roadsides in the North Country, which is fun. So in 2018, as part of this, Bern Blasi at Cornell has been working on purple loosestrife down at the Montezuma Wildlife Refuge for decades. And they've got it so under control with their biological control, they can no longer give people their biological control. It's perfectly back in balance. And if you've driven by there, you don't see a monoculture of purple loosestrife anymore. So I wanted to avoid the monoculture we were trying to get to, and maybe we could introduce a biological control. And I called up our local DEC office, and they were like, well, we can give you 1,100 beetles. Good luck. Okay, that sounds like a lot. We'll see what happens. And they called on a Friday, your beetles are here, come pick them up. Okay, now what do I do with them? And my wonderful interns that summer, we built some quadrants, we put them out in the field at Upper and Lower Lakes, and those have been monitored every year since 2018, which is great, and I'll show you a little data on that in a second. And then it's like, well, they don't want to give me anymore. They gave me 1,100, they're done. Now what? How do we work with this? So we started to build our own beetle hatchery. Thanks to the great people in Warren County, they had a whole method and it really works. So just to give you a quick overview of how you go through this. You find the beetles. They're about half the size of your pinky fingernail, just to give you a heads up. You have to find a large infestation of purple loosestrife in early May, and then you can harvest them before they go through their first cycle. You hire as many younger interns as you can find with good backs and strong days, and you go out in the field and you start digging up plants because you need to then bring them back to create your artificial wetland at SUNY Potsdam, which is really kiddie pools in the backyard. So we have our artificial wetland, which is kiddie pools to be monitored. We had about 60 plants in each one. You wrap them up to look like what someone described as doobies on campus, and then you put 10 individual beetles into each netted plant, keeping some aside without any beetles to be your feeder plants once those beetles have eaten everything inside their nets. You keep going, eventually you'll get these lovely little yellow larvae about 2 to 3 weeks after they start growing. Eventually they will fill those nets with hundreds of beetles from those 20 that you originally put in there. You will get more interns to aspirate every individual beetle one at a time. They will ask you repeatedly if there's a faster way. There is not. And then you'll have all of these, and we have released between 2019, 2021, 22, and 23, we think we're close to 30,000 beetles we've raised in these beetle hatcheries to then targeted release across the North Country. So the mapping informed where to put them, and then the beetle hatchery gave us enough to target where to release them. And last month I was contacted by Preserve Downstate asking if I had any to share. So we'll see how that goes next year. So one of the things, and I worked with Lilo Prism back in 2019 about this, was how do we know we're doing this the best way? Is the beetle hatchery the most cost efficient, right? It just takes some interns, a wetland that you create, or should we be mowing them, right? My initial question was, how is mowing influencing all of this? So at the Red Barn Preserve in Morristown, which was established in 2015, if you haven't been, it's beautiful, 150 acres of wetlands and hiking trails. They let me do kind of whatever I wanted. So I put 20 plots out across their wetlands, and I set them up in 5 different treatments. So there was a control treatment, just cutting off the flowers to see if that controlled how much growth the next year, cutting them to the ground, digging them up a foot, again, strong backs are required, and then I netted or tented some with just beetles and left them for a month. And so one of the things we wanted to prove was the beetles would survive and still be there the next year, and that the beetles weren't going to eat our native vegetation, right? That's the problem of introducing a second introduced species, is what a havoc is going to cause on your own ecosystem. So hopefully you can see close enough. This is the same quadrant as this. This is under his tent. The only thing in brown is purple loosestrife. Everything else is perfectly intact, not even a nibble. But the purple loosestrife was eaten down to dust, basically, in about a month. So the beetles are very much targeting only what they eat in this system. This is analysis done by one of my seniors, Mackenzie Biggie, this past spring, looking at what those treatments do. And it shows almost no difference over 3 years across multiple treatments. A, B, and C, or control, cutting the flowers and cutting to the ground, or mowing, do not control purple loosestrife substantially. There's a little bit of a difference, but nothing statistically significant. Digging it up actually creates a huge spike in growth because the seed bank, those 300,000 seeds that every plant releases, can be up to 1 million. That seed bank is robust. And in any wetland where water's flowing through, it's going to fill that void instantly. So digging it all up, not necessarily the most effective, ironically. The beetles, however, were the only ones that showed substantial decline. We only tented that first year, but the beetles were in the system. Now we had introduced them into that specific area. They were able to start controlling that quadrant over time because evolutionarily, the beetles can only fly about 10 meters. They are designed to hop to the new plant. That's it. They don't fly far away. They stay within their system. They eat it down. They are gone by the time the the plants flower in August. They have a very tight coevolutionary process. They are there until the plants are ready to do their thing. They burrow back into the soil, they overwinter, and the plants grow as big as they can to store energy for the next year. So beetle management is probably the way to go. But we're still finishing mapping the highways. Someone mentioned the problems of 2020. I still got out with my interns. They did a great job. We added another 68 miles to the route and went from Waddington all the way to Messina, and then Messina all the way back to Colton. So we've created a pretty big triangle to look at this area. The yellow is the original route, just from the blue line to Ogdensburg and Waddington to Clayton, or I'm sorry, to Alex Bay. And then the blue is the new area. And so you can't compare exactly the same. So it was 1 year compared to the next. But the beetles have now been put in the system. Remember, I started introducing them in 2018 in big numbers. 2017 was the test site, 2018, 19, big numbers into the system. And the beetles are starting to overwinter. We finally found them back at that original site before we introduced any more in 2021. So it took them 3 years to establish a set overwintering population in the same location. But they're starting to have an impact on the overall plant diversity. Again, it's not enough years to have real data, but it's getting closer. In 2022, I published a paper with some partners about all of this initial stuff. It's open access, you're welcome to access it. The title is still Mapping the Purple Menace. But we also repeated the beetle hatchery, and we got so many beetles that year. One of my former interns was now working at the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe's Environment Division, and we gave them some beetles to start releasing because they are also having trouble controlling purple loosestrife. And we started monitoring at their site. So in 2023, we expanded and monitored another, it was only about 16 miles, but again, you gotta double it both sides of the road if you're walking. And we started to set up more beetle release sites so we could monitor, are the beetles staying in this area? Are they able to overwinter? It turns out there's a lot of microcosms of environments across the North Country, especially as you go up the St. Lawrence. We notice the difference in the plants. It's very subtle, but it changes as you go along 37 and along all the way up towards Akwesasne. So we didn't know for sure they'd be able to stay in the system the same way. And in 2024, with more money from the St. Lawrence River Research and Education Fund, Akwesasne set up their own beetle hatchery last summer. We found plants for them, got it all set up, and they're gonna run their own this summer as well. So we've been building on all of these pieces each summer to try to improve this. So what does the analysis in this paper show? One of the things I try to teach my students is just because you know it doesn't mean you've proved it. Well, we proved that purple loosestrife lives in wetlands. Congratulations. It prefers it. While it will live everywhere, including a crack in a parking lot sidewalk, it does preferentially end up in wetlands. This was spatially demonstrated and able to account for all the other options. One of the other things one of my students noticed, because he's well on his way to becoming a good biologist, he said, it's funny when we see a culvert under the road, we tend to see it on both sides of the road. Remember, purple loosestrife can only drop about 10 meters on its own. A road is more like 30 meters across, so it can't fall on the other side of the road on its own. It has to be moving somewhat through the water that's flowing. So when the water rises and uses that culvert, it's moving those seeds on occasion. And purple loosestrife seeds can wait for that perfect environment. So culverts were a huge predictor of purple loosestrife presence compared to any random points along the route. The other piece that we saw is once you get one there, and this is typical of invasive species, once you get one, the spread is going to be almost exponential. So controlling that individual plant is really important. One of the disappointing pieces was modeling was not conclusive in any of our analyses. So that's the next step for the research. So what am I going to do this year? We need to keep looking at how this beetle impact is happening now that we've got 2 more years of data to look at and more sites at Akwesasne to compare. In addition, adding the new routes to the analysis is going to make a big difference. But one of the fun parts that I got to try last summer is working with Fort Drum, because when you work inside a military base and the person in charge of the Environment Division says, "What do you want to do?" he can make anything happen. So I had struggled with getting the Department of Transportation to let me use mowers strategically and things like that. They need to get their job done, and I understand that. But at Fort Drum, they were like, well, we don't have to mow here. That's great. Well, let's mow there. And they even dug up a whole bunch of plants and put them where I need them to be so that we have a perfect study for next year. And so we tested it out, and it does work. You can spray paint the plants with like turf marking, and then you mow through it and you figure out how far those little pieces of plant make it. And so we were able to test that to see how far the mowers themselves are actively spreading it. There's very little evidence, but there's a couple of really good studies. Purple loosestrife will regrow from a 5-centimeter cutting. It's not known to do this, but it has happened in lab settings. And given the spread generally, it should not be spreading along roadsides at the rate it is if mowing isn't involved, in my opinion. There's a study from the 90s that showed it across the thruway that it was happening, but nobody's done anything since. So that's the hope this summer, is to really look at exactly how far a mower can spread pieces of this, how big those pieces are, and what does it mean. And then, of course, another beetle hatchery. So what does this matter to a broader audience? What can you do now that I've ruined your opinion of purple loosestrife? Those individual plants, when you see one, it does not have that big woody connection to other things. Dig it up and put it in a bag and dispose of it. Burn it if you can. Do not just move it somewhere and expect it to dry out and die. It won't. It will reseed from wherever you put it the next year. We found that out accidentally. So you have to dispose of it more permanently. You can monitor this. Citizen science is amazing for this. People like to look at it. It's an easy to identify plant when it's in bloom. And it usually is also accompanied by a lot of other invasives. So it's worth keeping track of. It can be a bellwether for your area is becoming more diverse in one way, but invaded in another. So management tends to follow this practice. For us, for purple loosestrife, we're well into the management phase. It's going to be here, but the goal is with the beetles to bring it back into balance. So the hope is that we can bring it back into an ecological balance, not remove it completely. Thank you so much to all the people who have supported this research. You've done a really great job. The department's on campus. I've gotten funding and help from so many people to do this work. Usually it's conversations at things like this where someone's like, hey, there's a great place up here to go look at. And so I do that. But thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your time. And especially to acknowledge all of the interns that have done all of this work for the past 10 years. But I'd be happy to take any questions if we have time. Yeah?
How do the beetles and mowing get along?
The beetles and?
Mowing.
Yeah. That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about it. They are so small, though, And honestly, they're mostly done with their life cycle before the plants are big enough to substantially mow. So the beetles emerge in early to mid-May. They go through their first life cycle, they mate, the adults die, the eggs are hatched, they become larvae, and their second life cycle is done by the first or second week in July. They create larvae, the larvae bury into the soil, and they're done. The mowing of those actively, when you get like a 2-foot plant, wouldn't actually happen until late July. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. Yes?
What can you tell us about the duration of the viability of the seed? Will they stop 5 years from now? 10 years from now?
Yes. I'm sorry. There's not enough research at this point. They do know they are viable a very long time. Some of the control methods have found success flooding the plants. Like if you actually inundate the plants long enough, they will have a rough year. I'm really hoping the big flood we had last spring, especially around upper and lower lakes, is going to eliminate a big, unfortunately, part of my study site. It was so flooded, it was under 3 feet of water when we were walking out to it, where that young woman was sitting at the beginning when we were building the beetle hatchery. But there's evidence that those seeds will continue to sprout, that seed bank is really robust for decades. So unfortunately, this is a long process. Unless you get that one plant and dig it up, don't look at it adoringly, take a picture and walk away.
So we have an organic farm on Wellesley, and we have class 2 wetlands.
Yeah.
And we do rotation grazing with cows and goats. And I saw a purple loosestrife, and I'm like, ooh, that could be a problem. And then we grazed through there, and I kept watching for the return, and no sign of it.
Excellent.
So I'm interested to look at the wetland areas where the animals don't graze and see if it's there, but where the animals are grazing regularly.
I'd love to talk to you about that. Yeah, it's not a roadside hindrance we often get, but maybe just beyond it, yeah.
Okay, so I'm from the same farm, and we have one plant at the edge of the pond in front of our house, and when I saw the flowers, I cut them off and destroyed them.
Great.
I've done that for 2 years, and it has not spread.
That's exactly what you'd want to do. You're cutting the seeds, basically. You're preventing the seeds from falling. But it will propagate from its own roots, given enough time. So digging it up before you need a saw is a great idea. It's no joke. You can't pull them out of the ground once they get to 2 or 3 plants. Well, thank you guys very much. We'll move on to our next one.